لا
يشف الماء.
لا يشف الماء. شف يشف نو لا يشف الماء، وهو من باب شف يشف، من باب ضرب. Right? As mentioned by Tahtawi. Right? So لا يشف الماء. يشف الماء. They say, he says, من باب إذا رق, it's something that is thin, رقيق. حتى يرى ما تحته كما في الصحاح والمصباح. الصحاح وفي الأزهري الجوهري is that's what the Mukhtar al-Sihah is summarized and built upon.
So are these two shouts, are they for specifically for شيء ثقيل غير الجلد, or is this just for the صحة of a khuff in general? Like,
No, because the khuff itself is there's the khuff. The default of the khuff is leather. ما كان في معنى الخف is that which is ثخين. Right? Anything ثخين that fulfills the qualities of the khuf is akin to a khuf. So the khuf, which is المتخذ من الجلد, and then there's ما في معنى الخف, which is that has the qualities of the which are the things that are described.
is it possible for a khuff of leather to not have one of these two conditions, or is it required?
How?
That, like, let's just say it's loose, that it's not like staying on the shin, but it's leather and it comes up over.
No, but that's not a khuf.
So it has to fulfill these conditions.
No, but it's not a khuf if it does not fulfill these conditions. Like a khuf is that which you wear on your foot. So if it doesn't stay on your foot, it's not a khuf.
I mean, like, as if it's loose, like it's not against your shin, like it's a stretchy.
How is it? What do you mean by it's loose?
Like, let's just say that it's a bigger size, for example, maybe it's for someone who has bigger foot, or it's stretched out because it was on someone else's foot, and it's like loose like this. So with these two.
But it's on the foot.
Yeah.
The fact that it's loose is irrelevant.
So if it was loose on something not made of leather, would it make a difference?
Does it stay on the foot without having to be tied? So if it's a leather khuf, like it's a leather sock that, let's say a sock that doesn't stay on your feet, is it a sock? So let's say a khuf, right? Leather, the nature of leather has certain inseparable qualities by default. Like unless you do some funny things to it, but then it'd be essentially transformed. So leather, if it works from leather, it does stay on your feet, right? And leather, unless it's so fine, like you just have like the skin of the leather, but that's no longer leather, right? That if you took just the one layer, like just this leather film, right? That but then that's no longer considered leather. That's not jildun mutlaq, like ma mutlaq, that becomes muqayyad, right? If you took like a leather film that's so thin that water goes through it, then that's no longer leather, and it's become muqayyad. That's something different. But leather fulfills these conditions. So leather doesn't have to fulfill these conditions because these conditions are mentioned for that which is like leather. If leather doesn't fulfill these conditions, then the zahir is it's not really leather. There's some problem. Or the mani' would be something else. There's holes in it, so water goes through. But that's something different, etc. Okay, Bismillah. I'm good to go. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Imam Shurunbulali's Maraqi al-Falah, Sharh Nur al-Idah, we have, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reached the section on wiping over footgear, al-Mashu al-Khuffain, and we started looking at the conditions for valid wiping over footgear, and we reached the fourth condition. So the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, says, والشرط الرابع خلو كل منهما أي الخفين من خرق قدر 3 أصابع من أصغر أصابع القدم. The fourth condition is that both khuffs are free of rips that are greater than the extent of 3 fingers of literally 3 asabi' from the extent of 3 toes of the toes of the foot. Because, of course, right, the extent of 3 toes. Because in Arabic, asabi' refers to of the fingers of the hand or the fingers of the foot. Fingers of the foot in Arabic, in English, what do we call them? Toes. So that's why the expression, but you don't have to say toes of the feet, because you don't have toes on your nose, right? So when translating things like this, you wouldn't say of 3 toes of the feet, because no other body part has toes, right? لأنه محل المشي. لأنه أي القدم, because it is the place, it is the locus of the walking. So the rip is considered by that, right? Or it is what is wiped upon, right? It is what is wiped upon. So the rip that prevents would be to the extent of the area that is wiped upon, which is the foot, right? واختلف في اعتبارها أي اعتبار الأصابع مضمومة أو مفرجة. And then the ulama differed that would this be 3 toes together? Like, imagine these are the 3 toes together, or open, meaning normally open. مفرجة أي تفريجا معتادا. And this is approximative, because it goes back to, and this is a taqdeer. What does it go back to? That al-khuff لا يخلو عن قليل خرق بعد الاستعمال المعتاد. Like the khuff is typically not free of some rip if you use it extensively. So a slight rip is almost inevitable. A slight rip is almost inevitable, right? And in considering it to be preventative, there will be hardship, and hardship is lifted, right? Because there's wear and tear, and this was done anyways for what? For facilitation. So a slight rip is common, therefore there'll be hardship in avoiding it, and the rulings relate to the wealthy and the poor and everyone, and there could be hardship in it. But a large rip is not common. It's not common. Right? Even in a sock, like typically if you have a hole, how big is the hole in the sock? And recently I've had many holes. I have no idea what's going on with my sock. Have you been getting socks? I've been wondering, is it the washing machine? Like, what's going on? There's a mystery. But anyways, holes tend to be small. That's in socks, let alone in a leather khuff. A small rip. How big is the rip? This is a matter of ijtihad, because you just leave it to the opinion of the one morally responsible alone, people would be confused. Right? People would be confused. I have no clue what you're talking about. Right? I have no clue what you're talking about. So they'll be confused. So, and there's some khilaf in it. And you can see some of the khilaf in Tahtawi. We won't get into it. Right? Because this is taqdeer. The shar'i meaning is, right, that slight hardship, that undue hardship is lifted. Right? Undue hardship is lifted. Right? And there'll be undue hardship in considering that any rip prevents the use of the khuff. Especially if you think in classical time, a khuff, something made of leather is expensive. Right? So it would be difficult to afford. Right? People only had typically two garments, maybe three. Right? So a khuff, and that's something made from cloth. Leather is even more difficult. That is before, so because of that, so this taqdeer, there's actually various riwayas actually from Imam Abu Hanifa himself, right? One is that here too, في رواية الحسن يعتبر قدرها من أصابع اليد. That here too we consider the rip by 3 fingers worth, 3 fingers of the hand rather than 3 toes. But legally, where does the rip takes place? On the foot. So you'd consider extent of something on the foot, right? And this goes back to what would be considered a lot. Okay, so this is done out of taqreeb. Right? And so there are other opinions. So someone has waswasa, for example. The reason for these things is, again, you don't go around giving fatwa yourself, but these other opinions, right? And it has been chosen by distinguished imams of the madhab, like al-Razi, etc. Because 3 fingers of the hand are larger than 3 small toes. Right? Someone says, I thought that, I used to wipe over this khuff and it was slightly bigger than 3 toes. Firstly, when you wiped over them, you made an implicit judgment. What was the implicit judgment? That you can wipe over them. Right? So that's considered, a judgment is considered an ijtihad. This is not the mega ijtihad, in fiqh, but in one's own actions, ijtihad, that you exercise your own judgment. Right? And the principle is, al-ijtihadu la yunqadu bimithlihi. When you act upon it, implicitly you're acting upon, the assumption is, you deem that to be allowed. Now, you have a doubt that no, it was too big. Al-ijtihad la yunqadu bimithlihi. And there's leeway anyway, because even if it's slightly bigger, because this is an approximative taqdeer. Nobody says that you go and measure it, right? Nobody says that you go and measure it. Okay, Bismillah. But in things like this, as we reiterate, don't go around finding opinions and throwing them at people, but go and consult, right? That, okay, I've found this. How does this work, right? How does this work? What kind of what kind of, is this applicable, etc.? And to be asking those questions. Allah. And that's why Imam Shurun Bulali, what does he say? They differed as to, do you consider them madmuma, the toes, together or open? Which one is it? He doesn't even address it, right? He just says, اختلف, it's differed upon, right? Because you're not meant to weigh it. It's like, someone actually asked, like, do I need to use a mirror to determine whether there's an inexcusable amount of filth in my rear? I said, no, you just have to wash it away, right? Right? You just have to wash it away. You don't need to measure how much it is, right? And if, God forbid, like you ended up in the toilet, you have an exam starting, if you don't get into the hall in 2 minutes, you won't be let in. You had to use the washroom. You went there and there was no water and there's no toilet paper. Then, do you have to check whether there's a lot or a little? You just assume there's a little and go, right? Nas'alullah al-afiyah. Maybe sit away from everyone else or something, right? But Bismillah. Okay. فإذا انكشف الأصابع اعتبر ذاتها. If the toes themselves are uncovered, then the toes themselves are considered. فلا يضر كشف الإبهام مع جاره. Therefore, if the big toe, right, which is literally the thumb toe in Arabic, right, الإبهام, أي إبهام القدم, you know, مع جاره, with its next toe, وإن بلغ قدر 3 أصابع, even if it's to the extent in size of 3 fingers. من أصغرها, from the smallest of them. على الأصح, according to the soundest of opinions. والخرق طولا يدخل فيه 3 أصابع ولا يرى شيء من القدم عند المشي لصلابته لا يمنع. Now, a rip that is the extent of 3 toes in length, right? So someone was swatting another with their khuff, and the person felt threatened, so they took out their dagger, and the khuff got semi-slaughtered. There's a big cut in it, right? So, al-kharqu tulan, a lengthwise cut in which you could insert 3 toes, the extent of 3 toes, but when you walk, nothing of the foot or less than the extent of 3 toes of the foot ever show from that rip because of the thickness of the cut, or it's in a place where it doesn't, while walking, become uncovered more than the extent of 3 toes. لا يمنع, does not prevent. لا يمنع أي لا يمنع صحة المسح. So لا يرى شيء, nothing, أي لا يرى قدر مانع من القدم. Yani an impermissible extent does not show of the feet. Okay. Right? Right, so someone has a rip like that, right? Right? So Imam Tahtawi mentions, quoting al-Halabi, that al-mani' huwa يعني فالعبرة بانفراجه حالة المشي دون حالة الوضع. So it's what prevents is that it become opened, that the extent of 3 toes show during walking, not like when you take them off and you sort of pry it apart, the hole's big, right? Okay, Bismillah. And each foot is considered separately, which is why he says, وَلَا يُضَمُّ مَا دُونَ ثَلَاثَةٍ مِّن رِجْلٍ لِمِثْلِهِ مِنَ الْأُخْرَى. دون ثلاثة أي دون ثلاثة. This tanween, what kind of tanween is this? We're awake. What kind of tanween is this? What? تنوين التنكير is تنوين is ما يلحق بعض الأسماء المبنية, right? لدلالة يعني كونها نكرة لا معرفة, like سيبويهن, جاء سيبويه جاء سيبويهن, or مهن, right? This is تنوين العوض, right? Because it can be عوض عن حرف أو كلمة أو أكثر, right? دون ثلاثة أي دون ثلاثة أصابع, right? 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 من رجل لمثله من الأخرى. One does not gather the ribs from both feet, right? So the 3 is considered from 1 foot. So let's say if you have فلو كان على رجل خرق قدر إصبعين وفي الأخرى خرق قدر إصبعين. On one foot, the two toe rip, left foot, 2 toe rip. Do you consider both? Does it add up to a 4 toe rip? No. You consider each foot separately. So this is, others have expressed this in a simpler way, and you can find that. Right? Right? You can find it. If you look around, you can find a simple, more direct expression. Right? Yeah, so that's why ولا يجمع لا تجمع الخروق المتفرقة من رجلين بل من رجل. The Tanweer has an expression something along those lines, right? That if there's multiple rips, so someone walked on with their khuff on burning coals. So they got a whole bunch of little holes in their khuff. On each foot, those little holes are considered together. If those together on any one foot add up to more than 3, it prevents, but not separately. But now what if they're tiny holes? Some khuff, somebody, let's say, found a lot of small scraps of leather and they stitched together, so there's a whole slew of little holes all over the khuff. So he tells us, وأقل خرق يجمع هو ما يدخل فيه مسلة ولا يعتبر ما دونه. What is the مسلة? Right? Al-misalla is, it's a large needle. It's one that's used for, not for just individual clothing, but it's done for it's to stitch thick materials, right? Or to, like, for example, on like carpets or thicker things, felt, things like that. So it's a thick needle, right? So it would not be like, so like little holes, like just little, like if you look at, it's like small sewing holes, but these would be like, right? Like they would be like clear. So it would not holes that are like pins would not be considered, but holes that are like, that are like dots would be considered, right? Like a misalla is a thicker dot. It's like there's a clear hole. It's not just like, it's not like a pin, like a small pin, but it's like a dot. Like it's almost like, like a drop of water would go through it, kind of thing, right? Now because there are situations where something could have very thick stitching and so on. This is the majority opinion in the madhab, but sometimes someone could end up in a situation where they have haraj. There are other opinions within the madhab, right? And this again, it's mentioned by al-Tahtawi, right? That this is al-mashhur min al-madhab, right? But a number of people mentioned from Abu Yusuf that holes even on one foot are not considered together. وَارْتَضَاهُ الْكَمَالِ, and al-Kamal ibn al-Humam chose this opinion because it's based on ease, right? It's based on ease, and it's not based on textual evidence. This is an estimation of وَقَوَّاهُ ibn Amir Hajj, right? وَاسْتَظْهَرَهُ فِي الْبَحْرِ, and the author of Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq liked it a lot. استظهره أي بين كونه القول الظاهر, that this would appear to be the apparently stronger opinion. وَرَدَّهُ فِي النَّهَرِ, but his younger brother rejected it in the Nahar. فَلْيُرَاجِعْهَا مَنْ رَامَهَا, but At-Tahtawi says, right? So whoever wants to seek the answer to this, like the final word on this, then seek it out, right? But there is, so let's say someone did have a khuf that had a whole bunch of small holes. Right? They're not pins. It's not just like the thin stitching, but did have a whole bunch of holes. There's an opinion that it's not. Like now, practical caution is we don't act upon that, etc. But لدفع القضاء, like if someone had that situation, etc., then there's a lot of leeway for it, right? There's a lot of leeway. In fact, a lot of the later scholars chose it, and that's. So you can see that in Tahtawi. Anyone have is this mentioned by, which one are you looking at?
I'm looking at Shaykh
Okay. Anyone looking at? Yeah.
So he doesn't mention where you said about
the one. Okay. Okay. وشرط الخامس والشرط الخامس استمساكهما على الرجلين من غير شد لثخانته إذ الرقيق لا يصلح لقطع المسافة. The fifth condition is that they stay on the feet without having to be tied with anything external to them due to their thickness. And due to their thickness meaning that it's not like if you take thin cloth, you take something thin and you just wrap it around your foot, then what would you have to do with something that you wrapped around your foot? You'd have to tie it. That's not sufficient. Because هذا ليس في معنى الخف. Right? Let's say someone didn't want to buy a khuf, so they decided to use like bandage. Like they got thick bandage and they just wrapped it around their foot and then they tied it. That's not a khuf. There's situations where it could be correct depending on how the bandage was. وشرط السادس منعهما وصول الماء إلى الجسد. Right? The sixth condition for the validity of wiping is منعهما منع الخفين وصول الماء إلى الجسد, that they prevent water from reaching the skin. Of course, إلى الجسد, what? الظاهر هو التعبير بالقدم, to the body. But the obvious thing would be to refer, the more immediate thing to refer to would be the qadam, the feet, right? Right? فلا يشفان الماء, right? So they don't absorb, they don't let the water through. شف الماء, right? Tahtawi explained لا يشف الماء, right? Is أي لا يتجاوز منه الماء إلى القدم, right? That the water doesn't go straight through to the foot, right? Right? And this is why جاوز is to go past, right? And this goes back to understanding that هو من شف يشف من باب ضرب إذا رق لا يشفان الماء, that they're not so thin that the water goes straight through. That's the meaning of شف الماء. Because الشيء الشفاف, right, in Arabic is what? Is that which is see-through, right? That which is see-through because of how thin it is. فَلَا يَشِفُّ الْمَاء is that they're not so thin that the water goes straight through. لَا يَشِفُّ الْمَاء does not mean that the water does not go through. It does not indicate that they're waterproof. Right? فَلَا يَشِفَّانِ, the water doesn't go straight through. That's the meaning of لَا يَشِفَّانِ الْمَاء. Right? And you can spend as much time as you want looking up what لَا يَشِفَّانِ الْمَاء is. And right? And then if you look at al-Halabi al-Kabir and elsewhere, a whole bunch of the larger books discuss this out. Right? So practically, as al-Halabi makes clear, that if the water, it's يشف الماء إن وصل الماء إلى القدم فور المسح. Right? And I'm not quoting al-Halabi. This is what حاصل ما فيها. Omar, could you just share a snapshot of the section from al-Halabi al-Kabir? The PDF of al-Halabi al-Kabir is online. And if it reaches a little after, then that's not considered to be preventative, right? 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 So stating that stating that it's a condition that it be waterproof is a statement without proof, right? It's not. That's not a tenable position, right? And also, and of the many aspects to it, if you guys remember, I'd written about something about it ages ago. I could look at it again and share it. 104. Okay. And because the examples they use, if it's from thick cotton, وَلَوْ مِنْ كِرْبَاسٍ, they even say for emphasis, like they quote al-Nasafi, Hafiz al-Din al-Nasafi, author of the Kanz, from al-Kafi, even if it's from silk, but it fulfills the condition. Meaning thick, like you have raw silk, like which is a heavier, unprocessed silk. It's thick, but pour water. If you put even the thickest cotton or silk, pour water in, eventually it'll go through. Right? So at-tamthilu bihi yubayyinu al-murad. Right? It makes it clear that it's not any kind of so that's so and and there's some nice things in Halabi al-Kabir, right? He mentions the thing about عن أبي حنيفة أنه سئل عن مذهب أهل السنة والجماعة فقال هو أن تفضل الشيخين. Abu Hanifa was asked, what is the way of أهل السنة؟ أن تفضل الشيخين يعني أبا بكر وعمر على سائر الصحابة وأن تحب الختنين يعني عثمان وعلي. And you love the two son-in-laws, عثمان and Ali. وأن ترى المسح على الخفين. Right? Right? And the basis of that is the words of Sayyidina Anas. And he mentions many of the hadiths about it, etc. In there. Just give me a second, bismillah. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So we'll get it inshallah. So we'll share that. Okay, here. So in the Munyat al-Musalli it says أما المسح على الجوارب فلا يجوز عند أبي حنيفة إلا أن يكون مجلدين وقال يجوز إن كان ثخينين لا يشفان. Alhamdulillah. So it's page 120 of the old edition of Halib al-Kabir, which we'll share with you. Right? 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 And so he says ثم قال معنى قوله لا يشفان أي لا, so he's referring to Fatawa Qadi Khan, which is important because Qadi Khan's a big deal in the madhab. Like they said لا يفتى بخلاف قاضي خان, you know, 6th century great imam in the madhab, from his Fatawa. معنى لا يشفان لا يتجاوز الماء إلى القدم. ومعنى قوله لا ينشفان أي لا ينشف الجورب لا ينشف الجورب الماء إلى نفسه كالأديم والصلم. انتهى. right? right? ومعنى so معنى الشف نفوذ الماء إلى القدم، ومعنى النشف جذب الجورب الماء إلى نفسه، فحينئذ كلا المعنيين صحيح قريب من الآخر. right? He goes on. Yeah, so we there's a lengthy discussion on it, so you can see. And okay, so we'll have to dig it up because he goes into a really extensive discussion, but the hasil, and I put it in that article, we can find, because he has pages and pages on this, right? Bismillah. Okay. السابع والشرط السابع أن يبقى بكل رجل من مقدم القدم قدر يبقى يعني قدر 3 أصابع من أصغر أصابع اليد. That on each foot they remain from the front of the foot the extent of 3 small fingers of the hand. ليوجد المقدار المفروض من محل المسح, so that be enough space to actually be able to wipe. فإذا قطعت رجل فوق الكعب, So if the foot is cut above the ankle, جاز مسح خف الباقية. Then you can wipe over the khuf on the other one. وإن بقي من دون الكعب أقل من 3 أصابع. But if less than 3 fingers worth remains on one leg, لا يمسح, then you cannot wipe the khuf لافتراض غسل الباقي, because then you have to wash the stump below. وهو لا يجمع مع مسح خف الصحيحة, because in our madhab لا يجمع بين البدل والمبدل. The mubdal is washing the foot. The badal is wiping over the khuf. So if only a stump remains, there's not enough remaining to wipe all of it. So the other foot you cannot wipe over one foot and the stump wash it, because there's no instance of that in the Sharia. Rather, so if the foot is cut above the ankle, then the one foot that remains, because then you don't have to wash that foot at all, because there's nothing to wash. The one foot you could do mas'al al-khuf, but if only a stump remains below the ankle, less than the extent of 3 small fingers of the hand, then there's not enough place to wipe over a khuf on it. So then you cannot wash that one and wipe over the khuf on the other. فلو كان فاقدا مقدم قدمه لا يمسح على خفه ولو كان عقب القدم موجودا. So if one does not have the front of one's foot, one does not wipe over the khuf even if the heel of the foot is present. لأنه ليس محلا لفرض المسح ويفترض غسله. Because if one does not have the front of one's foot, one does not wipe over the khuf even if the heel exists, because the wiping is على ظاهر القدم, on the top of the foot. If only the heel remains, could you wipe over the heel itself only? No. So it would not be valid. Rather, one would need to wash there. Then he tells us about the time of washing. Now, what's the role of wiping over the khuf? Right? This is an important principle, right? Al-khuffu mani'un sirayat al-hadath ila al-qadam. It's an important concept to be clear about. The khuf prevents hadath from reaching the foot. Why is that significant? To understand when the time of wiping begins. It's not from when you made wudu, and it's not from when you put on the khuf. Someone made wudu for fajr, and they remained on wudu. 9 a.m. before going to work, they put on their khuf or their sock or whatever, right? Valid sock, like khuf or khuf-like thing, right? But they lost their wudu at 3 p.m. They stayed on wudu all day. Any problem with that? No. When does this time begin? From 3 p.m. Because it is then that the khuf is playing its role. Before that, if you wanted to have a khuf fight, could you do it? Just keep your wudu. Right? You made wudu, put on your khuf, then you take off your khuf and you have a khuf fight and you put your khufs back on, you're fine. Why? Because the khuf is not, what tahara do you have at that point? The tahara of washing your feet. Right? Like if you made wudu, you just put on thin socks, you took them off, put them on, does it affect your wudu? La, your tahara is a wudu. But then when you put on your khuf or the equivalent of the khuf, it starts playing its role when الخف مانع سراية الحدث إلى القدم. When you lost your wudu, this intangible state called hadath, this legal state, would have, what does hadath affect? أعضاء الوضوء, face, arm, head, feet. So they have this legal state, intangible legal state. It's أثر معنوي لا حسي. Now it's playing that role. So now how do we establish how long it is? From the hadiths of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So he says, وَيَمْسَحُ الْمُقِيمُ يَوْمًا وَلَيْلًا. The resident person can wipe for a day and a night, 24 hours. وَيَمْسَحُ الْمُسَافِرُ ثَلَاثَةَ أَيَّامٍ بِلَيَالِيهَا. And the traveler wipes for 3 days with their nights, meaning 72 hours. كما روي التوقيت عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Now, very often when they say ruya, it can indicate weakness, but not always, right? Yurwa, ruya can. But here, for example, the hadith is actually related in Sahih Muslim and elsewhere, right? Right, so it's not an absolute. كما روي, as is related. وابتداء المدة للمقيم والمسافر من وقت الحدث. And the time, both for the resident person and the traveler, begins from the al-hadath. Right? من وقت الحدث الحاصل بعد لبس الخفين على طهر. هو الصحيح. The time begins from al-hadath, from the first loss of wudu that takes place after having put the khuffs on in a state of purity. And this huwa sahih. And there's a difference between ala sahih, and this is the correct opinion, and this is the correct opinion. Huwa sahih indicates a greater degree of, or can indicate, just in terms of its lexical or its grammatical construction. لأنه ابتداء منع الخف سراية الحدث. Right? What do you have? Do you have khuf or khalaf? What do you have? منع what does your copy say? الخف, right? Khuf? Yeah. So our copy has an error, right? منع الخف. Because that's the time when the khuf now starts preventing the hadath to reach the foot, right? And that's, so now, only now it's starting to fulfill its purpose. After this, if you take it off, hadath reaches the foot, right? وَمَا قَبْلَهُ طَهَارَةُ غَسْلٍ. Before that, you're in a state of purity through washing, as we explained. وَقِيلَ. And it is said, min waqt al-lubs, from the time of putting it on, right? But this is outside the madhab, right? And this is the opinion of Imam al-Awza'i, as mentioned by al-Tahtawi. وَقِيلَ مِنْ وَقْتِ الْمَسْحِ. And some said from the time of wiping, and that's said to be the position of Imam Ahmad. Why are these mentioned? This is للخروج من الخلاف, right? To avoid difference of opinion, right? But in our own madhab, this time begins, you need to understand that clearly. But الخروج من خلاف العلماء مستحب ما لم يؤدي إلى ارتكاب مكروه في مذهبه ولو خلاف أولى, right? Avoiding difference of opinion of the ulama, but the ulama meaning imams of Islam, right? Recognized ulama, not just anybody, is recommended. But it's not intrinsically recommended. It's not something you're expected to do, right? But you're rewarded for it because it's practical caution. as long as it does not entail doing something makruh in your own madhab, even if it's somewhat disliked, or even some said khilaf awla. Right? And some of the ulama said, as long as it's not إلا أن يكون القول شديد الضعف, unless the opinion is excessively weak, right? or مخالفا للنظر, or it's far-fetched. And that's for لمن كان له أهلية النظر. Because there are some opinions that some people took out of their caution, etc. So they said لا. But that's the duty of the ulama, right? We don't have to worry. If you hear that if one's taken care of one's basics and one knows that there's a khilaf, it's good to take the means to avoid it. And these are two examples. Someone said from the time they put on the khuff, they'll consider that the time of wiping begins from there for them. That's more cautious, right? More cautious. وإن مسح المقيم ثم سافر قبل تمام مدته أتم مدة المسافر. If a resident person wiped over the khuff, then they traveled before the period of their wiping period ended, which at that time was 24 hours, and then they became a traveler, they complete the wiping that is allowed for the traveler, which is 72 hours. لأن العبرة لآخر الوقت كالصلاة. And this is summarizing a principle. والأصل عندنا أن الأحكام إن تعلقت بالوقت فالعبرة بآخره. Right? 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 And there's many expressions of this across the various texts. Right? Tahtawi mentions one. لأن العبرة لآخر الوقت وذلك لأن المسح حكم متعلق بالوقت. Because wiping is a ruling related to the time. فيعتبر فيه آخره. And because they said والأصل عندنا أن الحكم إن تعلق بالوقت فالعبرة بآخره. The basis in our madhab is that a ruling, if it relates to the time, then what counts is the end of the time. كالصلاة. So for example, if you're a traveler and the Asr time entered, how many rak'ahs are due upon you as a traveler? 2. You entered city limits and you started celebrating because you're so happy you reached your city limits, and you didn't realize that you drove straight into a dead end. So you hit, Nasrullah al-Afiyah, you hit the case against driving, of course. You hit the wall and you fainted. So Asr time, you're completely knocked out. Right? Then the Minister of Interior, but you weren't hurt, you just lost consciousness. Lutf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? You just had wonderful dreams of being back home. And you thought you're already having dinner with your wife, but then wife comes, opens the door, said, why are you sleeping in the car? And you're a bit groggy because you've just been knocked out. But in the meantime, you missed Asr. How many rak'ahs do you have to make up? 4 rak'ahs. Because even though when the time entered, 2 rak'ahs were due, بل الحكم إن تعلق بالوقت فالعبرة بآخره. At the end of the time, what were you responsible for? For the salah of the resident. If the opposite were true, that unlike you who are happy in your marriage, Zubayr was fed up. He left city limits and he's so happy that he, on his bike, that finally I get away from Zubaydah, he raised his hands and he drifted off the road, fell into a ditch, and lost consciousness at Asr time. But it's outside city limits. He'd started his journey. Asr time, how many rak'ahs would be due upon him for Asr? He was resident when the time entered. A traveler, when the time went out, how many rak'ahs are due? 2, right? Etc. Right? وإن أقام المسافر بعدما مسح يوما وليلة نزع. If the traveler becomes resident after they had already been wiping for more than a day and a night, meaning 24 hours, they take off their khuff. نزع خفيه لأن رخصة السفر لا تبقى بدونه, because the dispensation related to travel does not remain without the travel. بدونه أي بدون السفر. وإلا بأن مسح دون يوم وليلة يتم يوما وليلة. Otherwise, meaning if one had wiped less than a day and a night, then one completes the wiping off a day and a night, meaning 24 hours. So the traveler had wiped, the duration of the wiping was 20 hours so far, then they became resident, they have 4 hours left now. From the same start point, of course, right? لأنها مدة المقيم, because this is the duration for the resident person. So these were this is now related. You can break down, if you're taking notes, you should be please, right? Be writing out the matan with the sharh, right? And these points. So we completed looking at the conditions, right? And then that which relates to time, and then the extent of the wiping. And any decent edition should logically break this down into subsections, right? To help a student. Do you have any breakdown? You do? What does it say? Oh, this and that. But this. No. Yeah. Right. Most modern editions, and it's not to complain, but we have to realize there's responsibilities out there. Most publishers have no method to their publishing. None. They don't have a style guide, or they just have a skeletal style guide. Some have a style guide, but they don't use it. Most editors follow just vague ideas in their editing, but they don't apply them consistently. Where do you put a title? Where it makes sense. That's not fi'lul aqil. Right? And some of it's hik timshayat al-hal, they're just sort of doing whatever they can, but that's certainly not the sunnah of ihsan, right? وفرض المسح قدر 3 أصابع من أصغر أصابع اليد. The obligation of wiping is the extent of 3 small fingers of the hand. Right? And he says, وَهُوَ الْأَصَحْ. And this is the soundest opinion, لأنها آلة المسح, because the hand is the instrument of wiping. So what's considered is what you wipe with, right? وَالثَّلَاثُ أَكْثَرُهَا. And 3 fingers is most of the hand. وَبِهِ وَرَدَتِ السُنَّةِ. And this has come in the Sunnah. فَإِنِ ابْتُلَّ قَدْرُهَا. So if the extent of 3 fingers of the hand become wet, of the foot, وَلَوْ بِخِرْقَةٍ, even if it be with a cloth, أو صَبٍّ, or by water falling onto the foot. Right? Someone's making wudu and they're, splashing all over the place, as some people do here at Seekers, and may Allah forgive us and them. And your feet get sufficiently wet. Do you have to wipe over your feet? No. But it would be sunnah too, right? Because there's a sunnah related to the wiping, right? And then he says, وَالْأُصْبُعُ يُذَكَّرُ وَيُؤَنَّث. Right? The word usbu', it has multiple lughat. It has many ways. Right? So Al-Tahtawi mentions, وَفِيهِ عَشْرُ لُغَات. Right? تثليث همزة. So you say أصبع, أصبع, إصبع. Right? مع تثليث الباء. Right? Both the hamza and the ba have 3 possibilities each. ضمة, فتحة, كسرة. That's 3 by 3 is 9, and the 10th is أسبوع, like عصفور. Right? But some are more common than others, but in different Arab countries, they say it slightly differently. But some, but again, this is why hearing Arabic is important, right? Because it's a living language. And now, whose hand counts? That's a matter where the fuqaha differed, right? Because someone has huge hands, someone has tiny hands, right? So that's something Tahtawi says, even if they're not your hands. Right? Because let's say Hakimullah Juwan has much bigger hands than someone much shorter. So would he have to wipe the extent of his 3 fingers? That's certainly more cautious. But we say, the argument would be al-mutlaq yansarifu ila al-mu'tad, that the general, something mentioned restrictly goes to what's customary, right? على ظاهر مقدم كل رجل, on the top of the front of each foot. The top of the front of each foot, not the heel and not the bottom and not the mere sides. مرة واحدة. فلا يصح على باطن القدم. It is not valid at the bottom of the foot. ولا عقبه, and it's not valid to wipe the heel. وجوانبه, and the mere side, like purely on the side, without any aspect of what will be considered from the top. وساقه, nor the trunk of the foot, meaning that which is above the ankle. ولا يسن تكراره, and it's not sunnah to repeat the wiping. Right? And then an important point that Tahtawi adds, it's important to note here, right? وَلَا يُسْتَحَبُّ عِنْدَنَا مَسْحُ أَسْفَلِهِ. Right? Right? Because according to Imam Malik and Al-Shafi'i, right, it's sunnah to wipe the top of the foot and the bottom. But in our madhab, this is not recommended. So one wouldn't do so, right? Because one only avoids difference of opinion if it does not entail doing something disliked in one's own madhab. And then there's some nice quotes in Tahtawi, right? Has an interesting thing from Sayyidina Ali bin Abi Talib where he says, قوله, so in your copy it's page 191, right? على ظاهر مقدم كل رجل, says قال الإمام علي كرم الله وجهه لو كان الدين بالرأي لكان أسفل الخف أولى من أعلاه بالمسح. If religion was by mere opinion, then the bottom of the khuf is more deserving of wiping than the top of the khuf, because which is the one that gets dirty, right? Right? So Imam al-Tahtawi says, فعلى العاقل اتباع الشرع تعبدا. The intelligent person should follow the sacred law devotionally, right? That who are you? You are a servant. Allah is your master. What is the duty of the servant? وقالوا سمعنا وأطعنا فهمت أو لم تفهم. They say, I hear and I obey, whether you understand or you don't. وتسليما لعجزه عن إدراك الحكم الإلهية, and with submissiveness, because of your incapacity to fully understand divine wisdom. Right? And then he quotes Imam Abu Hanifa. وقد قال الإمام أي Abu Hanifa لو قلت بالرأي. If I gave rulings out of mere opinion, لأوجبت الغسل بالبول لأنه نجس متفق عليه. If I spoke out of opinion, I would say that you have to perform ghusl when you urinate, because urine is najis by agreement. وَالْوُضُوء بِالْمَنِي. And I would say that you only need wudu if ejaculate comes out. لأنه نجس مختلف فيه. Because ejaculate is differed upon as to whether it's najis. وَلَأَعْطَيْتُ الذَّكَرَ فِي الْإِرْثِ نِصْفَ الْأُنْثَى. It says, and if religion was by opinion, I would have given the man half the inheritance of the woman. لِكَوْنِهَا أَضْعَفَ مِنْهُ. Because she is in a weaker financial state than the man. But it's not, right? Religion is not, it's ta'abbudan, right? And we are tested in those choices, right? We are in those matters as to how we respond to the divine command, right? As to how we respond to the divine command. Okay. And then he says, وَسُنَنُهُ. It's sunnahs, right? Sunan al-masha al-khuffayn. A good exercise in reviewing each of these chapters, right, is to, if you take a chapter as a meta thing, what are they? What is it? Is to look at what are the sections of the chapter, can help to number them. Wiping over the khuf has 5 parts to it. The first has to do with this, the second has to do with this, the third has to do with this, fourth, fifth. So it's also very useful. Someone asks you, tell me about wiping over the khuf. If you've done kind of a mental map of it in this way, then you know, okay, you can sort of, rather than there's a big blob of material, you break it down, it makes it easier to retain, understand, etc. So وسننه مد الأصابع مفرجة من رؤوس أصابع القدم إلى الساق. Its sunnahs are that one extend one's fingers while outstretched and open from the tips of your toes to your shin, which is that which is above the ankle. Right? So but by saq here, the shin area, meaning to go past the ankle, right? لأن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم مر برجل يتوضأ وهو يغسل خفيه فنخسه بيده. So the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم passed by a man who was making wudu and he was washing his khufs, and the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم told him not to do that with his finger, right? Right? And in the narration in Tabarani, so he poked him, like, for the purpose of, getting his attention. He poked him with his finger. The narration that Tahtawi mentioned, the narration from that mentioned in Tabarani is that he poked him with his leg, because the man, presumably, because from the Sunnah, where possible, to do wudu sitting down, right? Right? And he said what is mentioned here, right? وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام إنما أمرنا بالمسح هكذا. And then the Prophet ﷺ explained to him, we are only commanded to wipe in this way. وأراه من مقدم الخفين إلى أصل الساق. And he showed him to wipe from the front of the khuf till the end of the heel مرة. وفرج بين أصابعه. And the Prophet ﷺ spread out his fingers. فإن بدأ من الساق أو مسح عرضا صح وخالف السنة. But if one began from the saq or wiped sideways, it's valid if you wipe the obligatory amount, but one went against the sunnah. So one shouldn't go against the sunnah, كما لا يخفى, right? And that's the sunnah, right? And then he tells us وينقض مسح الخف أحد أربعة أشياء. One of four things invalidate wiping over the khuf. أولها كل شيء ينقض الوضوء. The first is anything that breaks wudu. لأنه بدل, because the wiping over khufs is a substitute. Of course, a badal البعض من it's a substitute for part of wudu, not for the whole wudu, right? فينقضه ناقض الأصل. Then anything that invalidates the original thing would invalidate. وقد علمته. And you've seen what invalidates the wudu itself, right? والثاني نزع خف is to remove the khuf. لسراية الحدث السابق إلى القدم. Because this way, the original hadath that is being prevented by the khuf now reaches the foot. The siege falls, right? وهو الناقض. And this is the invalidator. The khuf now has done its duty, and its duty ends, so the hadath reaches the foot. في الحقيقة, And هو الناقض في الحق, this in reality is the invalidator, not the ending of the time. وإضافة النقض إلى النزع مجاز. So ascribing the invalidation to the taking off of the khuf is metaphorical. وبالنزع الخف يلزم قلع الآخر لسرعة الحدث ولزوم غسلهما. But if you take one khuf off, then the hadath reaches both feet, because they're one of the areas of ghusl. So a castle has two gates. If one is breached, the castle has been breached, right? ولو كان النزع بخروج أكثر القدم إلى ساق الخف, even if the taking off is effective, which is by the exiting of most of the foot from the khuf. في الصحيح, and that has to do with your loose khuf problem. لمفارقة محل المسح مكانه, because then the place of wiping has separated from its place, right? وللأكثر حكم الكل في المسح. So if a little of the foot comes out of the khuf, from below, it doesn't affect unless most of the foot comes out. So if you have to scratch your heel, you can do it. If your heel is itching, could you do it? Yeah. You're probably more cautious to stick a pen or something in, but not ideally a fountain pen, because accidents can happen. Okay. والثالث إصابة الماء أكثر إحدى القدمين في الخف على الصحيح. The third thing that invalidates wiping over the khuf is for water to reach the most of one of the two feet that are covered by the khuf, according to the sound opinion. Because that if most of the foot becomes wet, then it is as if you have washed that foot. Because للأكثر حكم الكل. And you cannot join between washing and wiping. كما لو ابتل جميع القدم, just as if most of the foot became wet. فيجب قلع الخف, then you'd have to take the khuf off. وغسلهما, and you'd have to wash both feet. تحرزا عن الجمع بين الغسل والمسح, in order to avoid joining between washing the limb and wiping it. Right? Right? Now what if someone did something fancy? Right? It says ولو تكلف فغسل رجليه من غير نزع الخف. What if one did more than required? And takalluf is to do that which is beyond what is required. Or beyond what is expected, or beyond what is praiseworthy. Right? And that's, of course, in adab, this is one of the sensitive things to be careful about. That, for example, in ikram al-dayf, in honoring the guest, what is the hadd of ikram? When is something considered honoring, and when is it considered takalluf? And there's two considerations. Urf is considered, but shara is not abrogated. And some customs, being able to hit that fair balance is not easy. Right? To being able to hit that fair balance. And we're still several months away from Ramadan, but if you read, for example, what the Imams of the spiritual path have written, or the ulam, or the fuqaha have written, or the muhaddithin have written about Ramadan, for example, much of what people do in Ramadan is a bid'ah when it comes to food. It's been bid'ah al-adat, but it's distant from fasting, because it's takalluf. And is acting beyond what is praiseworthy. And there's different things that are considered takalluf. And that's a separate mabhath. Okay, but if one did more than was expected, and they wash their feet with the khuff still on, without taking the khuff off, it is valid and it counts as washing the foot. So then, فَلَا تَبْطُلُ طَهَارَتُهُ بِانْقِضَاءِ الْمُدَّةِ. Then your tahara is not invalidated by the ending of time. So let's say someone has these, some of these mountaineering socks are such that not only do they prevent water from coming in, but they squeeze out water from inside. Because just in case you're mountain climbing, etc., and it's, so you don't want any moisture, they squeeze out the moisture. So someone, what they do, they pour water, they wash their feet from inside, and the feet dry out after. So you could, it's like you don't have to actually take them off and on. Anyways. وَالرَّابِعُ مُضِيُّ الْمُدَّةِ. The fourth of the things that invalidate the wiping over the khuff is the end of the time. لِلْمُقِيمِ وَالْمُسَافِرِ. Whether for the resident with their time, and whether for the traveler with their time. وَإِضَافَةُ النَّقْضِ مَجَازٍ هُنَا. And again, the ascription of invalidation to the time is metaphorical. وَالنَّاقِضُ حَقِيقَةً الْحَدَثُ السَّابِقُ. And again, what was the invalidator? Is that original ritual impurity that now reaches the foot. بِظُهُورِهِ الْآن. Because now it becomes manifest. فَإِن تَمَّتْ أي المدة. If the time period is completed, وَهُوَ فِي الصَّلَاةِ. And there in the prayer, بطلت. The prayer is invalidated. وَيَتَيَمَّمْ لِفَقْدِ الْمَاءِ. But then they could make another tayammum if they did not have water. يعني إن كان كذلك. إن لم يخف ذهاب رجله. But what if the time is over, right, and it's intensely cold? أو ذهاب رجله أو بعضها. Right? You're, unless you fear, of course, إن ذكر الخوف فالمراد الخوف المعتبر. Right? When fear is mentioned, it's reasonable fear. It's not unreasonable fear. I actually became friends with someone the day they arrived in Amman, the neighborhood we're in. The taxi driver dropped him at the wrong spot. So instead, because there's an entrance to where the masjid was, the driver just dropped him on one of the side roads, and he had to walk up like this rocky terrain to get to where the masjid was. The guy got freaked out. It was Fajr time. It's like, oh my God. Like there aren't even roads. There are roads. You just walked up the path. There's a road. You could walk around, go up, get around. But he walked up, and I don't know why he decided to do tayammum for Fajr. And he asked after praying with tayammum, that could I do tayammum for Fajr? Because this place looks really scary. It's not scary, it's still dark, right? There's not much lighting in the neighborhood at the time. I said, no. And he got mad at me. It's like, like Amman gets chilly, but it's, he said, how can you make tayammum? And he flipped out at me. Got really mad. I said, okay. So you asked the ruling. I'm just telling you what the ulama have said. Assalamu alaikum. I just walked down the hill. But alhamdulillah, he came to apologize. He said, I was feeling very scared. I said, Bismillah. I didn't address the issue. He said, I'd like to apologize. I said, no, I'd like to take you for breakfast. So I wanted to figure out, who's this guy? Because I'm not used to this kind of rough living. And the neighborhood's like a middle class neighborhood. It's not a rough place. So I took him for breakfast, largely for investigative purpose, to understand who this guy is. Alhamdulillah, he's a good guy. We've become friends. إِن لَمْ يَخَفْ ذَهَابَ رِجْلِهِ. Unless one fears loss of their foot, أو بعضها, or some of their foot, أو عطبها, or that it no longer function. من البرد, due to excessive cold. Just mere discomfort is not a fear. You wash your foot, they feel cold. It's winter. right? So that's neither fear nor is it harm. It's not darar, right? So mutlaqul, like you wash with cold water, your feet feel cold. But is there some fear of harm to your feet? No. A lot of people take cold showers, right? People swim, like in winter they go swimming. Nobody dies. Rarely, unless someone has some condition or something. فيجوز له المسح حتى يأمن, and it would be permitted for them to continue wiping over their khuff حتى يأمن, until they feel safe. And then Imam al-Shurmbulali says وظاهر المتون بقاء صفة المسح, right? And what would be apparent from the mutun, the core text of the madhab, is that you are still, so what happens? The time is over. You're a traveler, time is over, but you're in the wilderness. It's freezing cold. If you were to take off your khuf and wash your feet, you fear loss of life or limb for some reason. Sidi Zain decided to go to base camp of Mount Everest to celebrate his third anniversary of marriage. But they decided to go climbing somewhere, and now 3 days they've been solo climbing, husband and wife. There's genuine fear. It's minus 35 degrees outside. So there are two opinions here. One, Imam al-Shurmbulali says that what would appear from the mutun, right? And why this is significant, it says, وَالْمُتُونُ وُضِعَتْ لِنَقْلِ الْمَذْهَبِ. The mutun were placed to transmit the madhab. And most of the shuruh explained what's in the matan, and they did not object over here. And there's a dilala in there. That after 3 days, if you fear, so that after the time is over, normally for the traveler, but even for the resident, if you fear loss of limb or harm, you could continue wiping. He says, according to what dhahir of the mutun is, you continue wiping like you wipe over the khuf, which is how much do you have to wipe? Extent of 3 fingers of the hand, right? وَفِي مِعْرَاجِ الدِّرَايَةِ, and Mi'raj al-Diraya, which is one of the commentaries on the Hidayah, right? Right? And Tahtawi likes this opinion, and that's why he says, هُوَ الْمُعَوَّلُ عَلَيْهِ. This is the opinion that one depends upon. يَسْتَوْعِبُهُ بِالْمَسْحِ كَالْجَبَائِرِ. That in this case, one would wipe all or most of the khuf like the jabira, like the what's it called? Like the cast or the bandage. Because right now, what role is it playing? The khuf now has become like the jabira, right? That you are wiping on it due to fear of washing the limb underneath due to the cold. So Shurmbulali here at least here you can see a little more detail in Imdad al-Fattah, but here he does not commit clearly to one opinion. He does incline towards the opinion of the mutun because it says, because the mutun in themselves, ما في المتون مقدم على ما في الشروح, because what's in the mutun is given precedence over what's in the mutun or on the shuruh, because the mutun are there to transmit the madhab. So if they mention something and the commentary mentions something in itself, these are relied upon mutun, not just any matan. These are just dawabit of preference. Unless what's in the sharh is making tahqiq, is verifying that no, this is more correct because of A, B, and C. And then the other scholars of preference give preference to it. But here, Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam and others did take this position. Ibn Abdin took this as well. But there are two opinions in the madhab. So the caution would be that if for some reason you're not able to take off your khuff due to genuine fear, not just feeling lazy, such as someone who's mountain climbing or out there in the wilderness and it is generally that cold, then the safer thing is to wipe over the whole thing, if able to, with the rulings of the khuff. And if you fear by doing that you're threatening yourself, then the same principles as wiping over the jaba'ir, right, apply. Right? So it could be بالمس بالجبائر بأحكامها, right? Right? With their ruling. وبعد الثلاثة الأخيرة, and after the last three, وهي نزع الخف, which are removing of the khuf, وابتلال أكثر القدم, and most of the foot being washed, becoming wet, ومضي المدة, and the time passing, غسل رجليه فقط, إنما يجب عليه غسل الرجلين. It is only obligatory to wash the feet. وليس عليه إعادة بقية الوضوء, but one does not need to repeat the rest of the wudu. وإذا كان متوضئا لحلول الحدث السابق بقدميه فقط. If you are otherwise on wudu, because the hadath, if the time is up, or if your feet got wet, most of one foot got wet, or the time is over, then the hadath has now hit your feet only. It doesn't spread to the other limbs. So all you have to do is to wash your feet. ولا يجوز أي لا يصح المسح على عمامة وقلنسوة وبرقع وقفازين. It is not permitted, i.e. not valid, to wipe over a turban nor a cap, nor a face veil, nor over gloves. And it's related from the Prophet ﷺ that he wiped over a imama. But the hadith, and it's hadith related by Imam Ahmad and Nasa'i, but the hadith is mujmal. It does not describe how he wiped over it. Some of the narrations mention that he wiped over a turban, that because there's a type of turban of the Prophet ﷺ which had, where the tail of the turban would be wrapped around, right? Right. So they do that frequently while traveling, because what they would do is, if the wind started blowing, they'd cover their mouths, right? So the bottom part would come down and be wrapped around. Right? So they could cover their faces if the wind blew. Right? But that kind of turban can be difficult to take over. So some of the narrations actually mention that the Prophet ﷺ wiped over the front of his head and he completed it on his turban, alayhi salatu wassalam. It was mentioned by Imam Nawawi, I believe it's in his Majmu' and others, that so here the non-detailed hadith that he wiped over his turban is not sufficient evidence, because it's singular transmission, non-detailed, it's mujmal. It's understood in the light of the others that he wiped over. The majority of the ulama did not take this. Rather, they understood that he wiped over it, meaning he completed his wiping over it. He wiped the obligatory amount, which there's khilaf between the madahib on that, and he completed the wiping on the turban. And then there's the danger of comparative fiqh. Some people say, well, Imam Ahmad allowed it. Yes, but Imam Ahmad, according to this relied upon position in the Hanbali school, only allowed it in a certain type of turban, which is the one that is described in the hadith. That's one of the danger of what one of my friends calls fiqhul cocktail fiqh. Take a little from here, a little from there, mix it up, and produce something that nobody would be able to identify what kind of fiqh is this, right? Because the one who allowed it with conditions, right? Okay. And these other things, a cap or a hijab or a face veil, you can't wipe over, nor gloves. Why? لأن المسح ثبت بخلاف القياس. Because المسح المسح أي المسح على الخفين. Wiping meaning المسح المعهود هنا. This ألف is of عهد. Right? الذهني. Right? المسح, the مسح that we're talking about here, or الذكري, in the sense that it has been mentioned before. المسح المسح على الخفين ثبت بخلاف القياس, has been established contrary to قياس, meaning contrary to primary legal reasoning. فلا يلحق به غيره. So other things cannot be ascribed to it, because كل رخصة ثبتت على خلاف القياس فيقتصر فيها على موضع القياس. They say every dispensation established contrary to the qiyas, then it is limited to مورد القياس, أي ما ورد به القياس, to what, إلى موضع الرخص, مورد الرخصة, to what the rukhsa specifically relates to, and it doesn't go beyond that, right? So you can't make analogy between wiping over the khuff and gloves, because there's no textual basis for this, because wiping over the khuffs is unique. There's no relationship between the original ruling, which is washing the entire foot, and wiping a little off the foot, of something on top of the foot. The principles of analogy don't apply. والقفاز بالضم والتشديد, and قفاز with the ضمة and شدة يعمل لليدين. It's gloves. It's what's worn, what's made for hands. محشوا بقطن له أزرار يزر على الساعدين, and it typically has some kind of zipper, that's put on the arms. من البرد, for cold. Because Imam Shurbolali is in Egypt, where it doesn't get that cold, right? But there are Muslim lands, particularly Central Asia, right, where it get really, really cold, right? So you had to explain it to them. تلبسه النساء, it's worn by women. ويتخذه الصياد, but and it's also taken by hunters. من جلد اتقاء مخالب الصقر, to shield from the claws of predatory birds. والقلنسوة بفتح القاف وضم السين, a cap, المهملة. What do you have? مكان المجوزة. Right? And it is where is what you wrap the turban upon, just like a kufi, right? والبرقع بضم الباء الموحدة وسكون الراء المهملة وضم القاف وفتحها برقع أو برقع. خرقة تنقب للعينين تلبسهما الدواب والنساء الأعراب على وجوههن. It's a cloth where holes are made for the eyes that are worn by cattle. Now, something you have to appreciate, right? In the Arabic language, in classical Arabic, al-waw li mutlaq al-jam'. Waw, the waw is just to mention two things together. ولا تقتضي المشاركة في الحكم. المشاركة في المعنى. Right? That a ruling applies to A and B, it does not mean that there's a relationship between A and B. So X applies to A, it applies to B. So you can say A wa B. But doesn't mean that there's a musharaka fil ma'na between the two. Okay? Neither explicitly nor implied. And that's basic grammar. تلبسها الدواب وتلبسها النساء. And it's also al-A'rab. And it's also worn by desert Arab women. So be like the niqab, it's called burqa, على وجوههن, on their faces. And a simpler explanation of it الطحطاوي says الأولى ما تستر به المرأة وجهها. Right? It says because this is not specific to desert Arab women. Right? And sometimes they'd give it for cattle because cattle would be to avoid them getting bit too much by flies. Then he says فصل في الجبيرة ونحوها, and then chapter on the jabira and the like of it, and then we get to حيض. حيض نفاس واستحاضة وفهمها يحتاج للرياضة. This time inshallah we're going to go through some of the qawaid of حيض as part of this. Just the qawaid, we won't be reading the whole treatise. We'll suggest adding some additional reading on that, but we'll discuss that next class. Bismillah. So صلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.